welcome to this episode of Mindful Health, produced and presented by Shabnam Palesa Mohamed for Trial Site News, broadcasting from South Africa, wherever you might be in the world. Welcome to the show and thank you for joining us. Our topic today on Mindful Health: can psychedelics treat depression, addiction issues, and age-related mind health challenges? We're very delighted to have joining us today on Mindful Health Dr Mobeen Syed, who is a very famous physician, also has a background in engineering, which he'll tell us about, and an educator who harnesses both the right and left side of his brain very effectively, using the arts and illustration to teach science and health. Dr Mobeen Syed, welcome to Mindful Health and thank you for joining us.
Shabnam, thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for Trial Site News as well to have me.
Can you tell us more about yourself for those viewers who haven't as yet met you?
Absolutely. So very simple. I am a medical doctor and a software engineer as well. Plus, I am a medical presenter. And the thing that I take pride in is that I present with cartoons or illustrations. The intent, the purpose of doing that is to make sure that medical education can be democratized, it can be relayed to more people, and even those who are not in medical profession.
Fantastic. Of course, as many of us may know, a compelling study covered in mainstream media last year showed that psychiatric drugs' mechanism of action is questionable at best and not effective at worst. And of course, they say that psychiatric drugs may have little to no impact on mind health. Recent studies into neuroplasticity and the effect of psychedelics such as psilocybin have activated significant interest in the healthcare community and civil society alike. Now, Trial Site News has been covering the effect of psychedelics such as psilocybin and DMT on depression and addiction. You can find those articles on the website trialsitenews.com. But our guest today, Dr Mobeen Syed, recently hosted a show on the specific topic of a new study, fairly new study, on psychedelics, specifically psilocybin and its mechanism of action and the science. And I found it so fascinating that we've invited him to join us today on Mindful Health. Dr. Been, if we can please start here, can you define for us first, what is neuroplasticity and what is a psychedelic?
Absolutely. So the neuroplasticity is the ability of our brain to form new synapses, and synapses are connection between multiple neuronal cells, and also reorganize synapses. So not only form them, but reorganize them. And there was a theory that our learning and memory is constructed by forming new connections or synapses. So that is neuroplasticity. Just an additional part in here, as we age or as we weather various kinds of ailments or inflammations, for example, pandemic or psychological stresses, our connections start becoming lesser and the reorganization becomes impacted, and we then feel that as our memory is not working correctly, or we're not able to recall, or we're not able to remember newer things or the older things, and then we're not able to plan and perform the executive functions very well. So all of those can be connected back to one of such factor that can impact them is the neuroplasticity. The second thing, the psychedelics. Psychedelics definition can be looked at in multiple ways. There is one definition that is psychedelics are hallucinogens. And if you take that definition, then many drugs can be part of this group. However, a more traditional or classical definition of psychedelics are also for hallucinogens, but these are called serotonergic hallucinogens. What that means is hallucinogens are the ones that alter our perception temporarily of the reality, or expand our mental abilities temporarily. The serotonergic hallucinogens are the psychedelics that are traditionally called psychedelics. These are the LSDs and the psilocybin and DMT. However, if you just go with the hallucinogens in general, then there are some other drugs as well which are not serotonergic and are included in the psychedelics. The discussion that we will do today will stay with the classical understanding and definition of psychedelics as being hallucinogens that are serotonergic. And I'll explain a little more as we discuss further.
A wonderful introduction into the topic as of psychedelics as potential therapy, and we're certainly seeing the science on this reflect itself in the various studies and of course ancient wisdom perhaps in people and communities that have been using psychedelics and psilocybin, for example, for their mental health. Certainly a practice that is quite common here in South Africa and on the African continent. Dr. Been, how do psychedelics work? What is the mechanism of action?
This is a beautiful question, and there has been research on these. Some areas were unknown, some are being found out. There is a latest research. It's a study that is on a mice model, which shows how serotonergic psychedelics work. And before I explain it with my cartoon illustrations, I'll pose a question to the audience, which would then help us understand the answer that I would give in the with my illustrations. The question is, serotonergic psychedelics or serotonergic substances should all work the same way. That means if you take an antidepressant, which is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor or SSRI, that substance's function is to increase the stimulation of serotonergic receptors in our body, also called 5-hydroxytryptamine receptors. If we say that psychedelics that are serotonergic perform the same function of stimulating the same receptors, then in theory, psychedelics and SSRIs should be the same thing. However, here is now the question, that is, the psychedelics produce hallucinogenic outcomes. Psychedelic alter perception, while SSRIs do not. And that is the basic question to keep in mind when I explain the mechanism. So I'm going to, Shabnam, if you allow me, I'll share my screen.
Yes, absolutely.
So this particular mechanism is mentioned in this study. This is published, I believe, 17 February 2023, so pretty recent. This is the mice model plus in vitro cell model, in which what they did was they used psychedelics to see what is the effect on the neurons. Then they modified the serotonin to see if they could produce the same effect. So it's a fascinating study. Let me explain how it works. So the first concept to keep in mind is what is a neuron? Because we're going to talk about neurons and their connections. So a neuron is a nerve cell or a brain cell. What it has is it has a cell body, and then it has a number of branches from it. It has a long branch, usually long branch, which is called axon. Axon is the one from where the neuron sends the signal out. And then it has a number of smaller branches, tree-like structures, which have branches like trees as well. These are called dendrites. Dendrites are the one through which a neuron receives signals. So if you see here, this neuron is sending signals, and these signals are ending up on the dendrite of this neuron. Similarly, here is another neuron that is sending signal through this axon that is relaying or ending up on this synapse. So another important thing is to keep this in mind, that when a neuron ends, the axon ends, and the dendrite of the other cell starts, this little junction is called a synapse. When we talked about the neuroplasticity, we actually were talking about this area that we can form new synapses or we can reorganize the synapses. That means we can probably take this neuron and instead of connecting it here, we can connect it somewhere else. Or we can bring more neurons that would get connected in the other areas. So that is the neuroplasticity. Okay, cool. So now we know what is a neuron. It has a cell body, axon, and dendrites. Then the second concept, which is really important to understand the function of psychedelics, is the arborization. Arborization is really the growth of the dendrite. Imagine tiny little microscopic trees growing on the head of a neuron, on the cell body of a neuron, or soma of a neuron. These little branches, they come out of the neuron cell body, then they divide just like trees divide. And I think you can appreciate that if more of these branches are present and those branches have further branches, the more connections a neuron can make. And conversely, if there are less branches, less dendrites, and then the less branches of the dendrites, then this neuron will make less connections. In general, fewer connections it leads to depression. So for example, let's say one person had 1 trillion connections. And now at age 50, they have 20 billion connections lesser. That can lead to depression. Depression is one outcome. Then, of course, cognitive declines, memory issues, and other functions of the brain can decline as well. But mood change is an important indicator of reduction in the neuronal synapses. Arborization is the process where branches are created. And the more branches and more dendrites that are present, a person's mood becomes better, plus their memory and their cognitive functions are improved. So dendritic complexity reduces connections, break, leading to depression. So we discussed that. Now, of course, we can connect this thought now that neuroplasticity, which is really production of new neuronal connections or reorganization of the connections, is all dependent upon the arborization of various neurons. Remember that axons cannot be increased in number. If a neuron has 1 axon, it would just have that 1 axon. It cannot have 2 or 3 or 4. But dendrites and their numbers and their branches can be changed. And that is the neuroplasticity. Now, psychedelics. I'm going back to the question that I posed in the beginning. Psychedelics were observed to cause an increase in arborization of the dendrites, or an increase in number of dendrites and the branches of them, which also meant an increased availability of empty synapses that can then connect with other neurons. And as the complexity of the neuronal junctions increase, the person's mood becomes better, and the memory becomes better, and cognitive functions become better. And they saw that psychedelics do it, and the serotonergic drugs do not do it. And that was the big mystery, because psychedelics also act on the same receptors. So they started thinking about it. They said, what is going on? That serotonin doesn't do this while the psychedelics increase the arborization. And they found out that serotonin and psychedelics they can connect with the 5-hydroxytryptamine receptors present on the surface of the neuron. So that was a common area. Serotonin can bind there and psychedelics can bind there. That means their function, their outcome would also be very similar. However, they also found, and I'll come back to this in a second, they also found that psychedelics This is the key concept for today. If in the whole out of the whole discussion, you can just take away this one concept, that will be sufficient. They found out that psychedelics can actually slip through the cell membrane and enter inside the cell. This was the most important discovery that this paper is offering. Compared to serotonin, serotonin was not able to get into the cell. So of course, and they became curious at why did one serotonergic substance can enter the cell and the other one not. And it turned out that psychedelics, their structure is such, they are little more lipid soluble, they're little more greasy, they're little more oily compared to serotonin. And the oily, greasy things, substances, can actually move through the cell membrane and enter the cytoplasm. On the other hand, charged substances, the substances that have positive or negative charge, or are, we usually call them water soluble, they cannot enter the cell membrane. They need specialized channels to bring them there. So, first important thing, that psychedelics can enter the cell. Then the second thing they found out was within the cell, there are also serotonergic receptors. There are also 5-hydroxytryptamine receptors. So here is the second important thing. Remember, the question in their mind was, well, if we have serotonin and we have another serotonergic substance, psychedelic, and we put them, we give them, we administer them to people, serotonin does not cause arborization. It doesn't cause hallucinations, while the psychedelics cause hallucinations plus arborization and improving the depression and the mood in general. Why is that? And they found out that as psychedelics go in and connect with the 5-hydroxytryptamine, they initiate a signaling mechanism within the cell that allows the cell's nucleus to open up the genes that in turn allow the arborization to start occurring. This is such a beautiful mechanism. This is such an important discovery that psychedelics can improve the arborizations of dendrites. That means it can improve the capability of the brain for neuroplasticity. That means it would improve new connection formations. That would mean also, and Shabnam, I think this is the most important third part now, when we make new dendrites and we make new branches and we make new connections, they will not just disappear the next day. It is not that today you took serotonin and you became less depressed. As soon as you don't take serotonin, you'll become depressed again. On the other hand, if you took psychedelics, even one dose can help trigger enough dendrites that they stay for some months. I mean, you can't just make a new dendrite and then the next day it just goes away. That doesn't happen. So this is actually more long-term change in the neuron. It's a structural change. You're actually literally growing the brain. So you can't say that, all right, today I'll take psychedelic and my brain will grow, and tomorrow I won't take this and the brain would go back to the way it was. But that is the case with serotonins or other antidepressants. They work temporarily, and as their effect goes away, we are back to the square one. This is a very important thing. So this was my AI-generated concept of the psychedelic hallucinations. So here now, they wanted to prove this. So they found out that, all right, this is the mechanism of psychedelic, and that is psychedelics can get into the neuron and then they attach with the 5-hydroxytryptamine receptors in there. That would then signal with an unknown mechanism not discovered yet. The signal increase arborization, which would then improve the neuroplasticity, which would then improve the mood and less depression and so on. So then the question was, okay, if this is the discovery, then if we took serotonin, which is not able to get into the cell, if somehow we brought serotonin in the cell, then it should do the same thing as psychedelic does, because eventually they connect with the same receptors. It's only that one is not allowed in the house and the other one is allowed in the house. So if you can somehow bring serotonin in the party as well within the house, then it should do the same thing. So what they did was they did two experiments. In one experiment, they jolted the neurons with electric currents. And this is a very common thing during experiments, that you do electroporation. Electroporation is that you give electrical current that opens up pores in the cell body, which then allows various substances to move in and out. So here they put the serotonin outside. Serotonin was now waiting. They gave electric shock to the neuron. Remember, this is not happening to a mouse or a human. These cells were sitting in a petri dish. So they gave electric shock to this. That opened up the pores, which allowed the serotonin to get into the cell. The second thing that they did, they actually produced special channels that could pick up serotonin and bring it back in the cell. These channels are called SERT channels. Guess what happened? They then had mice. So once they could see that we can bring this serotonin in through these two pathways, then what they did was they took mice, and one group of mice did not have SERT channels in them. Other group of mice was genetically modified so that they would exhibit SERT channels on their neurons. Then they gave them serotonin, not a psychedelic, serotonin. And of course, in this mouse, and these mice were depressed mice. So in this depressed mouse group, serotonin was not able to get into the neuron because there were no SERT channel. And that is the case for all of us. And so there was no head twitch response. Head twitch response is an indicator of mouse's happiness. So when mouse becomes happy or when it starts hallucinating, its head twitches. So that is called head twitch response. So those mice that were given serotonin but did not have the SERT transporters, their depression did not reduce. They did not develop the head twitch response. So they did not hallucinate. On the other hand, those mice, which were modified to give them SERT channels on their neurons, they had serotonin get into their neurons and do the same thing that psychedelics do. So the mouse started developing head twitch responses, meaning they started hallucinating. That means it is really the psychedelics or serotonin, they're actually going to behave the same as long as they can get into the cell. So then the conclusion of this paper was that what it means is that we can, of course, they're not going to say that start using psychedelic because there is no control. It is illegal in many countries. For example, in the US, it's not fully legalized. I think there are just a couple of states that have it. Otherwise, other states, majority of the states do not legalize it. Federal level does not, it's not allowed. So the researchers, they are from UC Davis, University of California, Davis. They said that maybe we can modify serotonin and make it a little more greasy by changing one little methyl group on the chemical substance. And that would allow it to enter the neurons, and that would allow it to cause not only antidepressant effect, but also arborization of the neuron dendrites, which will produce long-term antidepressant, mood stabilizing, and better cognitive outcome. That is a beautiful study. And thank you very much for letting me explain it.
It's fascinating just listening to you explain it, but also being able to illustrate, which is such a useful mechanism of learning. But essentially, you're saying whether it's the serotonin or it's the psychedelic, as long as it's able to be transported effectively inside the cell, it will have exactly the same effect in terms of mood, in terms of building dendrites, perhaps, and it can be as sustained as a psychedelic. So essentially, there would be no difference then if you could get serotonin into the same spot we're getting the psychedelic into. Is there any difference at all?
No, so there will be no difference. The point of this study then was to say that psychedelics have a superiority over antidepressant like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or SSRIs. The superiority is that they promote the neuroplasticity. So then the question becomes, how do you convert that into a drug in a substance that can then be approved and that can be given and the doses can be measured and you can go get the pills for that. And so for that, their proposal is to change serotonin or find new molecules that can do this, or even have psychedelic molecules and change them and dose them differently. So to your question, they will become the same. The only difference will then become that you can now dose them accurately according to the depression and then change a person without causing too many hallucinations and or other side effects.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating content we're learning right here on Mindful Health. Dr. Been, is the mechanism of action of psilocybins any different, or do all psychedelics behave the same? You can reference that recent study, or what else would you like to share with us on that question?
Yeah, so they all behave the same. I would, if you give me a few more minutes, I want to create a context of this whole discussion as well in terms of legality in the US, the amount of budget involved for antidepressants, and a few more such thoughts. So is that okay?
Absolutely.
All right. So I'm going to share my screen. And first of all, I wanted to go here. You said that it is legalized in South Africa. In the US, that is not the case. So here, and all of these links,
I'm not certain that psychedelics are legalized in South Africa, but very much in the indigenous communities, certain plants and herbs are used, and they're not regulated as strictly.
I see. Got it. Thank you very much for clarifying that. So here is the US map, and I'll send you these links that you can share with the audience as well. And in this US map, all these gray states, they have psychedelics fully illegal. The orange states have some cities that have approved or legalized, or allowed, or decriminalized psychedelics. Light green they are making an effort to reform their laws to allow or decriminalize or reduce the criminal outcomes of psychedelics. That includes my state here as well, California. I believe there is a city in here that is allowed, that has done it, but generally they're working on it. And the deep green, Colorado, legalized and decriminalized, legalized and regulates the provision of psilocybin and psilocybin services, and also paves the way for additional psychedelic compounds in 2026. And similarly here, Oregon legalizes and regulates the provision of psilocybin and psilocybin services for non-medical purposes. So this is one I wanted to put in front of our audience, that it is on the federal level, it is still fully not legalized. Then the second thing I wanted to share is the kind of budget or annual spend related to antidepressants. So if you see here, this is CISION and PR News, and this is a site where people put their news out there. And if you see here, US, again talking about US, affecting about 40 million adults. Remember, in the US, about 80 million are children. So out of 330, we have then the rest 250 million adults, and out of them 40 million adults are affected every year. And there are many kinds of anti-anxieties and antidepressants. Even then, there is 30% of the patients that are resistant to antidepressants. And we spend annually $42.3 billion to $46.6 billion on antidepressants. And we are not making a lot of progress. We are making people resistant to them, but we're not really making a lot of progress. Plus, the antidepressants and their side effects are also something to consider. This is a study that we just saw. This is another article which I think is really cool to look at. In this article, they talk about how various psychedelics and their studies are going. And if you see here, psychedelics also have a longer lasting effect than an SSRI regimen. This is really important. Psychedelic is not just a hallucinogen, and well, serotonin can become that as well if it enters the cell. That is not the point. The point is psychedelics, according to this latest study that I showed, they can increase arborization of the dendrites, which increases the neuroplasticity and the ability for neuroplasticity. That is not going to be done by any other antidepressants. Even ketamine does have some such effect of neuronal changes, but it is a transient effect. Psychedelics have long-term effect. So psychedelics also have a longer lasting effect than an SSRI regimen. A 2015 study of more than 190,000 Americans demonstrated that past history of psychedelic use decreased the odds of suicidal thoughts or actions over the course of a lifetime, whereas a history of other drug use, such as sedatives or inhalants, increases these risks. I actually have that study open here as well. So let's see. Correct. So this is the study that they are mentioning. And in this study, they show that the lifetime use of psychedelic actually reduces the suicidal thinking and the psychological distress and past years suicidal planning, whereas lifetime illicit use of other drugs was largely associated with an increased likelihood of these outcomes. Can you imagine this? That it's not only antidepressant and longer duration antidepressant, but it is also it reduces the suicidal thoughts and suicide planning. I'm sure then they have not put that here, but I'm sure then it would reduce the number of suicides as well. So that is a very powerful outcome. Similarly, certainly people have been injured while taking psychedelics, most famously Diane Linkletter, daughter of radio and TV personality Art Linkletter, tragically died by suicide in 1969. Presumably while taking LSD. Following her death, Linkletter became a prominent voice in the anti-LSD movement. It is unclear whether LSD led her to suicide, but no drugs was detected in her autopsy report. The point I'm making is, when we talk about psychedelics, there is a risk with overuse. Psychedelics do not cause a craving or habituation or addiction, but still overuse of anything can be damaging, and one should be very careful. The point of these studies and presenting them is that there is a very powerful potential in psychedelics, but how to use them, I think we have to be careful, and we have to see how is the right thing to do. Now, I also wanted to share another study. This is a human study in which there was 59 patients enrolled. 30 were given psilocybin and the 29 with the escitalopram, which is an SSRI antidepressant, and they found no difference between them. However, if you look at the study, that study looked at the transient short-term outcomes between the two drugs. And I would suspect that if you're just going to watch a person, for example, let's say for a few days, their dendritic arborization has not completed. You need the dendrites to change. And it's not that today I gave the psychedelic and tomorrow the new dendrites have grown, or today I put the seed and tomorrow a tree is formed. It would take some time. And then once the arborization has occurred, then the neuroplasticity would occur, where the newer connections will start forming. So it is not something that can just happen over a few days. And I suspect that because of this study did not show any effects, because it just looked at the outward behavior of the psychedelic and serotonin working on the outside receptors and reducing depression, but they could not measure the long-term effect. I think this kind of a study, good that these studies in humans have started. Many of the states do not even allow these studies, but good that studies have started. I think there will be a design thing where they should allow many months, 6 months to a year, to occur to see what kind of neuroplasticity and outcomes can be observed. Then this is another interesting study. This is the New York University. psychedelic drug therapy may help treat alcohol addiction. So as the psychedelics, and just a very quick view of the other references, these are just the definitions of various things that we were talking about, and I'll come back here. The point is that as you improve a person's brain's connections and reduce their depression, they would actually develop more control over their life. They would develop more engagements. They would develop more working behaviors. And the result is that alcohol addiction, so I'm not talking about usual alcohol use, but alcohol addiction started reducing as well. So there are
Dr. Bean, do you think that's
outcomes
related to some sort of an impulse control mechanism that may happen by the use of psychedelics on addiction?
Absolutely. So one reason, there are many, many reasons for addictions, but one of the reasons is that when we feel out of control, when we are depressed, when we are not happy, when we feel we are losing, then people gravitate towards things that would, excuse me, that would take them out of that pain of the reality. And alcohol is one such substance. However, when you give psychedelics or 5-hydroxytryptamine agonist that can go into the neurons, may that be modified serotonin or psychedelics or something else, they would cause mood improvement. Number one, by antidepressing effect, and number two, by arborization and increased neuroplasticity, which would then, of course, make the person engage in their environment, become happier, have much better control over their life, and then have less dependence on alcohol.
I want to share this article on TrialSite News regarding the use of DMT for depression, and a biotech company here receiving a regulatory approval for a new study. This was an article in November last year. And this company called Small Pharma received the green light for a DMT trial, a phase 1 randomized placebo-controlled blinded study taking place at the Mac Clinical Center in Manchester. So certainly we're seeing these developments and unmet need in depression, psychedelic therapy and depression, the potential for DMT being rapid onset in assistance. Supporting its therapeutic use, ayahuasca, similar to psilocybin, can decrease activity in a network called the default mode network, or DMN. Certainly a very interesting article, developing DMT therapies for depression, and about Small Pharma, that article available on trialsitenews.com. I wanted to also ask you about adverse effects from psychotropic, allopathic, those type of drugs for depression, anxiety, suicide ideation, etc., as compared to adverse effects from psychedelics, including psilocybin.
So, if you are, because the psychedelics are not regulated, so we are not very much sure who took what in and how much dose. And so, plus there are no studies that have collected that this dose would cause these side effects. So far, the side effects that we see are perception change or reality change. And that is, I believe, the trips that people actually want the psychedelics for. There is just one such case of suicide after or attributed to psychedelics, but in postmortem, there was no psychedelic, as I read that. There are no other side effects, but there are many anecdotes. Some people say that somebody took psychedelics for some time and they developed severe depression and severe mood imbalances, which they never came out of. So I have heard those stories, but there are no such studies that have attributed those. On the other hand, antidepressants, because these are drugs and these have been properly gone through the trials, we know their dosages, we know their side effects, and then as they're being used as in production, in market, we have further understanding of their side effects. One tendency of the antidepressant drugs can be that if somebody has taken another medicine or some liver enzyme modulators, they can get out of hand and they can cause uh, depressive thoughts, they can cause suicidal ideations, they can cause mood abnormality while trying to produce the mood uh, or normalcy in mood. Similarly, sometimes patients talk about the zombie effect of an antidepressant, where they're just moving around, or their family members are moving around, not very well connected with the reality and not able to really appreciate the events around them. And I think there are some drugs that intentionally try to do that kind of a balance so that the person's overthinking or suicidal ideation can be controlled. The point is, antidepressants do have a lot of side effects, plus they have transient effects, plus there is a possibility of developing resistance to them. On the other hand, psychedelics so far haven't shown that kind of uh, side effects. Again, these need to be studied. Plus, they are showing much more powerful effect of neuroplasticity. So I think it will be great, and it is, that we continue to do more research in the area of psychedelics and start figuring out how do we allow psychedelic-like drugs, serotonergic psychedelics, or the psychedelics themselves, and we can provide guidance, we can provide regulations to say somebody for depression, their doctor can offer psychedelic in this dose or this modified drug. And I think that is where we will end up. I think we'll do a service to ourselves to do more research in this area and not just bank on the antidepressants.
Absolutely. What are your thoughts on the subject of withdrawal symptoms from psychotropic, allopathic antidepressants as compared to more natural psychedelics, psilocybins, for example? There is evidence to suggest that in a number of cases where people have gone and, unfortunately committed violence in a school, for example, taken an assault rifle and shot up innocent people in the school. In many of those cases, the individual was on a particular type of psychotropic drug and may have not have access to it at the time or experience the opposite of what the drug was intended to do. Talk to us about withdrawal symptoms, comparing both.
So this is a very interesting question, and this is unfortunate that antidepressants, when taken in larger doses or withdrawal, can bring a person's mood transiently in a bad state, which during that time they can harm themselves or others. So I wanted to share this. This is psilocybin. This is Science Direct, and they say over here, psilocybin and other hallucinogens are not considered classic drugs of abuse because they do not have reinforcing properties and do not produce drug-seeking behavior. Use tends to be episodic and is generally short-term and experimental. Tolerance occurs with repeated dosing and is thought to be due to downregulation of 5-hydroxytryptamine receptors. These are 5-hydroxytryptamine 2A type receptors. There may also be cross-tolerance between LSD and psilocybin. Psilocybin, like other hallucinogens, is not known to cause dependence, craving, or withdrawal. Right? So at least from what we are seeing in literature, these seem to be safer and have a potential greater than other antidepressants. I feel that at some point they would take up these psychedelics, convert them into drugs as well. I just wish that Big Pharma doesn't start making money out of them, but instead we can use them for more service to human beings than to another, cash cow.
Absolutely. That's always the hope and the wish of civil society. This is another article. You were talking about alcohol addiction just now. This one on psilocybin for treating methamphetamine addiction. This one published in January 2023 on Trial Site News, going into psilocybin and substance abuse. A study by Dr. Christopher Nichols from the UWM School of Medicine and Public Health will determine whether psilocybin therapy changes psychological and biological measures of mental health and addiction in methamphetamine abusers. I mean, the possibilities are just fascinating and
Yeah.
endless and therapeutic, and would make such a big difference in people's lives, investigating psilocybin's therapeutic mechanisms and going forward, and about the Transdisciplinary Center for Research into Psychoactive Substances. A few more
Absolutely.
questions I want to ask you, Dr. Been. The one is, we've talked about psilocybin or psychedelics for depression and anxiety. We've covered it in relation to addiction. What can you share with us on the effect of psychedelics and psilocybin for age-related cognitive decline?
So, very good question. And the age-related cognitive decline occurs in all of us. I am now 54. I'm aware of how these declines. I've been studying them occur, and now I'm kind of observing myself as well. That what is that route? How would it look like? However, the specific action of 5-hydroxytryptamine 2A receptor inside the neuron where psychedelics work, and they trigger the neuron. We still do not know how, but they open the gene expressions in the neuron to allow more dendrites. That would definitely help reduce or decelerate the age-related cognitive decline. I am very confident that if arborization, as we saw in the study, is a mechanism that is done, and do you know that this arborization can start occurring even one or two doses? I think if this is researched more, there would be a potential to use these drugs for age-related cognitive and general neuronal declines or brain decline.
I mean, the benefits are just enormous, and still so much to be discovered. Why do you think there's been a certain level of hesitancy and a narrative against the use of psychedelics?
I think that is just a stigma that has developed with this one, that it has been used mostly for these trips and by hippies, for example. And so there has been a cultural aspect attached to it. And I think that we should go beyond that to actually see what is in these substances and what is the potential. As we can see, that potential is tremendous, and why not use this? But that social stigma that is attached with it, and we attached it. I mean, we as a society decided to do that. Sure, if somebody is tripping, they may have a different kind of a behavior than the rest of us. And maybe we look at that and we kind of say we don't like it. But that doesn't mean that the substance's effect and the positive effect is something that we should not harvest and use.
Do you think there might be more uptake from healthcare workers in the industry to psychedelics for depression, addiction, and cognitive decline? Do you think more of these studies and these research studies are going to help, or do you think it takes a particular type of curious and innovative mind in the healthcare worker to explore these different therapies?
I think it is really curiosity will be everywhere. So if you go to the neurosciences or if you go to the psychology and psychiatry sciences, they would be very curious about these things. The problem is the regulations and the disallowing even the research. And so people need to have grants to be able to run trials. And if these are not allowed, then they cannot actually do the work, even if they're curious. So I think curiosity would keep increasing as more and more such studies would come in. And these states that have started making them decriminalized or legal in these states, and just like in UK, these studies would continue to increase, and there will be a threshold point where then the dams would break, and then we would have other states and other. I think at some point pharmaceuticals are going to jump in. As soon as they see that there can be billions of dollars made from it, that is when things would change.
Last question for you. In a fascinating conversation with Dr. Mobeen Syed, access and cost depending, what are your final comments on the scientific and social impact of psychedelics?
So social impact, we know it right now that it offers people an alternate expanded reality, as they say, or altered perception. So that mostly is for the entertainment, or even in some cases, I could say escape from the current reality. But I can only imagine that there is the antidepressing effect of that as well, that is useful to the users. However, scientifically, I think these will be the new directions in which antidepressants would go. I am going to make a bold statement. It's just an opinion. I think the future antidepressants are not the ones that we are working on right now. The future antidepressants are going to be the direction of psychedelics and more substances.
It's a very interesting insight there, and certainly the economic impact is also to be seen. People who are less depressed and less addicted to substances and have better cognitive health are certainly contributing more meaningfully to society. So all in all, scientifically, socially, economically, we can certainly see the benefit of psychedelics usage therapeutically in society. And I just want to start closing off by sharing this with you. Africa, of course, is seen as a market where highly profitable growth in pharmaceuticals is still achievable. Africa's pharmaceutical industry grew to 28.56 billion USD in 2017 from 5.5 billion just a decade earlier. The African market may be worth 56 billion to 70 billion by 2030. A 2021 forecast on Africa believes it is opportunistic for multinationals and pharmaceutical companies seeking new sources of growth as developed markets stagnate, while patients will gain access to medicines previously unavailable on the continent. So certainly psychedelics and different type of therapies for mindful health are going to become increasingly important. It'll be interesting to see what happens on the African continent given its long history of natural and indigenous and psychedelic medications and therapies. I want to say thank you very much to Dr. Mobeen Syed for joining me today on mindful health and contributing to better mind health. Thank you very much, Dr. Syed.
You are very welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
And your website, where can people find more of your content?
So my content is on drbeen.com, DRBEEN.com, or they can go to YouTube as well. Some of the content is on YouTube, where they can say Dr. Been Medical Lectures, and then they can find my channel there.
Excellent. Thank you also to TrialSide News listeners, viewers, and supporters around the world. Remember to challenge the 3 C's: conflicts of interest, censorship, and corruption. And share this interview across all your platforms and networks. Feel free to translate it and tag me on Twitter. Until the next edition of Mindful Health with Shabnam Palesa Mohamed for TrialSide News. Remember, stay informed to stay healthy. Take care.